Good evening, sir, and welcome. Those drills that were described by Putin as the largest since the last 3 decades. Why do you think these exercises, these military exercises, are very important in terms of the timing, the geographical framework, and also this cooperation and Chinese presence with Russia?
Well, the Russian naval exercises are of great significance, so much so that Washington will be observing them very closely and with some trepidation, because these exercises demonstrate that Russia, whilst fighting a major war in Ukraine, has the capability to simultaneously carry out naval maneuvers on a global scale. Thus, the Russian naval exercises are occurring in the Pacific and Arctic Oceans, in the Baltic Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, and in the Caspian Sea. And they involve approximately 400 vessels, including battleships and submarines, nearly 150 aircraft, and close to 100,000 personnel. That is why I say these exercises are extremely significant, and the Americans will be compelled to take this into serious consideration. The Russians, as I said, are fighting a major war in Ukraine, but the overall capacity of the Russian army, which has been deployed to Ukraine, is only between 12 and 15%. So it shows once again that Russia is a military superpower. We know that Russia is a nuclear superpower, but it also demonstrates again that Russia's military superpower is back intact. We've heard so much nonsense from Western politicians and Western mainstream journalists alleging that Russia is short of personnel, Russia is short of equipment. These naval exercises refute that so convincingly that I strongly suspect that Western mainstream media will not report on these exercises to any great level at all.
When we talk about the geographical framework, of course, it is a very strategic one. We're talking about maritime naval drills, and of course, those who control the maritime corridors are the one controlling over the world. And today, China is contributing to those exercises. China is, of course, very keen on this area, the Japan Sea, and also all those corridors that are related to the Belt and Road Initiative of China. Why do you think China is present, is contributing to those exercises, and what kind of threats will the US feel while looking at that deep cooperation and coordination on the naval level between both countries?
Like Russia, China is threatened by America. In particular, the Americans are attempting to enclose the Chinese Navy in the Pacific Ocean, and in particular in the South China Sea. So this is an opportunity for China to come together with Russia and say to the Americans that they will not allow their navy to be enclosed by the Americans, indeed not to be enclosed by any country in the world. Because if the Americans are successful in placing a naval cordon on the Chinese, then this will have not just serious ramifications for the growing power of the Chinese military, but it will also have very serious negative consequences for the Chinese economy. Because, of course, China has a very large merchant fleet, and by the Americans attempting to enclose the Chinese in the Pacific Ocean, this will limit the ability of the Chinese merchant navy to deliver Chinese products to all four corners of the world. So China looks to Russia for leadership and experience in contending with the Americans. Because, of course, throughout the Cold War, Russia, or as it was then the Soviet Union, was contending with America across the world. And in recent years, that level of rivalry is matching the level of rivalry between Moscow and Washington in the Cold War. So, of course, the Chinese have a great deal to learn from the Russians. And on top of that, the Chinese military, whilst it has made great advances on its own, is still very dependent on Russia for sophisticated pieces of technology. For example, for Chinese fighter aircraft and for Chinese battleships. So the Russians and the Chinese are showing a united display of force against the Americans. This is not an aggressive posture by Moscow and Beijing. It is a defensive posture by Moscow and Beijing. After all, we do not see the Russians or the Chinese attempting to place a cordon on America, be it in the Pacific Ocean or in the Atlantic Ocean.
What about Japan? How can we assess the position of Japan in that level? Because, of course, there was some kind of conflict between Japan and Russia after the Second World War regarding some kind of islands between both the countries, and there are no peace treaties between China and Japan after the Second World War. But that military positioning, that military deployment, also the tensions between Korea and the US on one hand and Russia on the other hand. So how can we assess the position of Japan and also the stance of Japan on that level?
Well, Russia and Japan are historic foes. Indeed, technically speaking, Russia and Japan are still at war with each other because Russia and Japan never signed a peace treaty with each other in 1945 because the Russians captured from the Japanese South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and the Japanese do not accept Russian sovereignty over the aforementioned territories. So, of course, there is no love lost between Moscow and Tokyo, but because Japan lost the war in the Pacific Ocean to America in 1945, it meant that the Americans achieved a very serious foothold in Japan. Now, Japan is certainly not a colony of America's, but nonetheless, Japan is a strategic friend and ally to the Americans. And because of that, the Americans can use their position in Japan and also in South Korea, again, to monitor very closely Russia and to monitor very closely China. And again, to try and place that cordon on both Russia and China to limit Russian power in the region and Chinese power in the region. But of course, all of this posturing by the Americans through their allies, the Japanese and the South Koreans, is not conducive to the peace and well-being of both Japan and South Korea. It benefits only the Americans. It is not in the interests of the ordinary Japanese or the ordinary South Korean to become embroiled in a military confrontation with either Russia or China, but it does suit the interests of the Americans. So the situation in the Far East, in the Pacific Ocean, is extremely tense, as it is extremely tense in Eastern Europe. And that is because the Americans do
Sorry
not...
to interrupt you, sir. Sorry to interrupt you. Where do you think where the things will go, specifically after you mentioned the tensions in Eastern Europe and the escalation in Ukraine, and now those drills in the Far East. Today, Russians accused the US of escalating the situation all over the borders with Russia, and also militarizing the situation in Japan. But of course, Russia also said that it will not stand still against the hostilities of the US in Japan near the Russian borders. It will not stand still against that. So, where do you think the situation is heading? What kind of consequences will occur, specifically after this huge confrontation that is still ongoing in Ukraine between Russia and the NATO?
The Americans are very well aware that their global supremacy is being seriously challenged by the Russians. So, for example, it's not just in the Far East where there is tension, it's not just in Eastern Europe where there is tension, but there is now tension along the Finnish-Russian border. And that is because of the Americans. From 1945 up until a couple of years ago, there was a very good relationship between Finland and Russia. The border there was very peaceful, but because Finland has been dragged into NATO by a Western compliant government in Helsinki, Finland is now posing a threat to Russia because NATO is increasing its presence in that country. And as I said, Finland is also a member now of NATO. That is not to the wishes of the Finnish people. The Finnish people do not wish to become embroiled in a war with Russia. But you ask, how will this end? Well, the Russian army, sooner or later, and I suspect sooner, will emerge victorious in Ukraine. The Russians will either capture all of Ukraine or most of Ukraine, and thus Russian national security will be preserved in Eastern Europe. Then the Russians will have to increase their military presence along its border with Finland, and the Russians will continue to develop their naval power. The Russians are looking to have a navy as they did in the Soviet period. And I have no doubt about it that the day will come when the Russian navy will more or less resemble in size and power the Soviet navy. And of course, the Americans will be extremely concerned by that, and they will be extremely angry by that. The Russians will be able to expand their Pacific fleet, and I do believe the Russians will, as a result, will be able to fend off any challenges by the Americans in the Pacific Ocean, and China will also benefit from that because, as I said, the more powerful Russia becomes militarily, it means that the Russians will be able to assist the Chinese in certain areas of military affairs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Papadopoulos. The host is introducing you and thanking you once again for your contribution to this discussion. Thank you so much, sir. Our discussion is over.